everyone. Sorry to disturb you, but all right. I'll just give everyone a second to get settled down. So once again, hello everyone. My name is Divya Marothra. I'm a first year at the college, and I've been studying political science and business economics. I'm incredibly excited to welcome you all to tonight's event, 2022, America's Political Pendulum. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I'd like to mention our next IOP Speaker Series event. On March 7th, the IOP will be hosting a conversation with Patrick Gaspard, the former U.S. Ambassador to South Africa, who currently serves as President and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Mr. Gaspard will be discussing global trends that could factor into America's midterm elections in a conversation with IOP Pritzker Fellow Anna Gallant. Tonight, we'll be hearing a discussion that will touch on the political stories that dominate America today, ranging from the midterm elections and an open Supreme Court seat to President Joe Biden's upcoming State of the Union address and the implications of the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our panelists include Amy Walter, who has been the publisher and editor-in-chief of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, an independent, nonpartisan newsletter that tracks and analyzes federal and state elections since July of 2021. She previously served as national and senior editor of the publication and political director of ABC News from 2010 to 2013. Fun fact, she was even awarded the Washington Post's Crystal Ball Award for accurately predicting the results of the 2000 election. We can certainly trust her to make some accurate and valuable insights tonight. Our other panelist is Mark Murray, senior political editor for NBC News, who also regularly writes and edits for NBC's blog, First Read. Having been at NBC since 2003, he has reported on numerous midterm and presidential elections, including what he calls the 4 change midterm elections since 2006. Hopefully we'll get to hear his thoughts on whether 2022 will be the 5th straight change midterm election. Finally, tonight's moderator is David Axelrod, director of our very own Institute of Politics. His experience includes serving as President Obama's senior advisor and campaign's chief strategist, and also appearing as senior political commentator at CNN. I'm thrilled to hear from our distinguished speakers, and I hope you are too. Once again, welcome to tonight's event.
Thank you so much. Thank you, and we have to mention the other, I think, coveted resume item of yours, both former Pritzker Fellows here at the Institute of Politics. Exactly. Those were formative experiences.
Very much.
They were for us, anyway. So there's so much to cover, but I think maybe the best place to start is just a general thought from both of you, and you both do a lot of deep thinking about this stuff, about the political moment we're in, the mood of the country, the state of our politics, and how that flows into the year, the election year.
It feels as if we are in a constant state of chaos and uncertainty and anxiety. Mark listens to many of the same focus groups that I do. You, I know, are sitting in on a lot of these, and I've yet to sit in one where the terms depressed, disappointed, scared, anxious have not been uttered within the first 2 minutes. That is everybody's experience right now living in the world, regardless of whether they identify as a Democrat or Republican or independent. So there's just this overall, is malaise, can we use that word? Has that been?
Yeah, I think the 40-year rule is,
I think we can use that. We can use that term now. So that there's a big piece of that. And that, I think for so many folks, the change from Trump to Biden, it wasn't going to make everything miraculously better, but it was supposed to at least bring some stability to the world. We weren't going to have the tweeting and the yelling and the arguing and the drama and the minute by minute you had to keep your phone or your TV on because you didn't know what at any moment we could be taking Greenland or we could be out of NATO or we could, whatever it was, something
now
could be
Putin's doing it.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So what I hear, especially from folks who were the swing voters in 2020, the ones who, maybe they voted for Trump in 2016, but they voted for Biden in 2020, they say, I just thought we'd be in a better place by now. I really did. We're not more unified. We're as divided as ever. We yell at each other now over Facebook, but also we have people punching flight attendants in the face, like what is happening? So we seem angrier than ever, divided as ever. And what is going on with COVID? Wasn't he gonna like fix this? I know it's a disease, but it seems like we can't quite get our arms around it. The administration didn't.
You're bumming everybody out
I'm
here.
sorry. And then the economy. And then the economy sucks. But other than that, it's great. It is great. So I don't hear a lot of optimism. And as you well know, both of you well know, it is not fun to be an incumbent at a time when people are pessimistic and don't feel confident about the future. And so I think with the Russian invasion this week, it's just one more example about how it seems like the world is still as chaotic and unstable as ever. And we can talk about the fact that NATO's aligned. Isn't that great that the U.S. can work with our allies and put these sanctions together? You know, the center has not collapsed. But I think for folks watching at home, it feels a little bit like it has.
Yeah, I want to come back to Ukraine because it's obviously the story of the moment. But Mark, how much, you know, my podcast partner, Mike Murphy, said on one of, I mean, you may have been there, I don't know, but he said it turns out that COVID is a killer of presidents.
Yeah.
And there's no doubt that Joe Biden probably wouldn't be president but for the pandemic. Now, how much of what he's dealing with is related to what Amy was talking about, the fact that he was elected to get us past that, and yes, a lot of other things, and restore normalcy, and here we are, we're still looking out at an audience of really good-looking people whose faces we can't see.
Yeah, you know, one of my colleagues put it really well that Joe Biden has really been facing a whack-a-mole presidency. And when you look back at the first 6 months of his presidency, that malaise that Amy was talking about really wasn't all that evident. Right. You know, vaccines were on the way. You were getting your vaccine. People were thinking about we were going to have a return to kind of a roaring 20s where there are going to be so many parties and get-togethers and fun. There are going to be
hot
weddings.
vax summer.
And when a lot of smart Democrats were starting to talk to me about the midterm landscape, the best case scenario they thought was everyone's going to be happy. You're going to see government was able to get people vaccinated, that this is going to be a time where people are going to think the country's heading in the right direction, and that Joe Biden would be able to benefit. And I would argue the first 6 months, it looked like there was a chance for that to happen. But then Amy is actually right. The next 6 months and then the months after that have been kind of the malaise part of the Biden presidency. And it just hasn't been COVID, although, David, I would argue, I still think COVID is about a good 65% of it. But now it's with inflation, Afghanistan, now the situation that's playing out in Ukraine and Europe. But I also think that the most immediate current events that we're seeing play out in Europe right now are also a reminder that things can always change. And I'm a believer that at some point a midterm environment does get baked in, yeah. But what we are seeing is high instability and unpredictable things, and a reminder that political landscapes sometimes can change in the blink of an eye. And so
Which is why it's so impressive when you win the Crystal Ball Award.
I know. You know what I did, by the way? I'll only tell you guys, so keep this to yourselves. But it was, I don't know if you remember this, Washington Post would do this contest. They don't do it anymore. That it's the weekend before the election. It's not just who's going to win the presidential, but it's like, how many seats will Democrats have in the House? How many will Republican? How many seats in the Senate? What will the, final electoral college number be? And I was super stressed about this, mostly because I was going up against the reigning champion, the AP government students from one of the local high schools. That's who won in 1998, and I was like, look, I can lose to like Stephanopoulos or Axelrod, that's fine, but I am not losing to high school students. And I did, I beat them. They came in second.
Right.
And I just dunked on them. I was like, see that, kids? You think you know about politics?
Still going to therapy for that, I'm sure.
Yeah, right.
So I agree with what both of you said, that I think that there is, we're out of sync. There is a sense that things are kind of out of control.
Yes.
And the expectation or hope was that Biden would help bring things back under control. Tell me what you think the political ramifications of this latest development is in Ukraine. Because one of the things you said, Mark, is things can change. One of the things that Democrats hope will change is inflation, that it might recede. Seems like this is going to make it harder. We're going to be looking at higher gas prices and perhaps other things along with other disruptions. Tell me what you think this does to the president. And we're political people, so we're having a political discussion. There are significant geopolitical elements to this and values elements and so on. But just as a pure political matter, what does this do?
Yeah, purely political and staying in my lane and not getting into geopolitics. To me, what was really interesting, at least these first 24 hours, was that so much of the political heat that Joe Biden has usually received from Republicans dissipated. That all of a sudden, the kind of statements from Josh Hawley, from Missouri, or other Republicans that just almost reflexively would always criticize Joe Biden ended up being a lot more restrained. Maybe to the most restrained that I've seen since the inauguration for Joe Biden. So there is some space that he has and a kind of an opportunity to rise to the occasion, be a Churchill in the Oval Office, and with also the idea that things can change. The other component too is, at least for the long term, and we start looking at 2024, I don't know, this Russia story, and with everyone so focused on it, I wonder what it does to the former president, Donald Trump, and kind of given the statements that he's made, because we've seen so many Republicans almost kind of wormhole the former president's statements on Russia. And if this becomes not a multi-month story, but a multi-year story and a long, long campaign, the former president's hold on his party and on 2024, I think it's going to be an interesting story. I still think that he still is the dominant force there, but it becomes a very different story. But then, David, you're exactly right on the domestic front, on rising prices, the sacrifices that not only potential U.S. military would end up having to have, even just going to NATO countries to bolster them, but the kind of sacrifice that Americans have to pay as well. It is such an open question, and I'm kind of looking forward to what the answer is come 2023 and 2024.
Yeah.
Amy, I guess the question is, what is it that people are thinking about when they sit around the kitchen table? And are they thinking about Ukraine, or are they thinking about gas prices? And are they asking themselves, there was this AP NORC poll yesterday, I guess it was, that said, only 26% of Americans want us to get involved. I think they meant militarily, but clearly there was a tepidness. There is a mood of isolationism in the country.
Absolutely.
So where does that leave the president, who has a responsibility to stand up to all of this?
And there's an opportunity, as Mark pointed out, to be that statesman. I mean, he's been now in front of the American public more in these last 36 hours than he had really since the beginning of his presidency. I mean, be consistently speaking out on Ukraine, so it does give him the platform. But I think he comes into this with three significant challenges. One, he's already seen, thanks, I think, in part to Afghanistan, but all the other things that we talked about with inflation and COVID, with much lower, there are lower opinions of him now as a leader than where he was in June. Right? Had this happened in June versus now, I think you might be seeing a different kind of reaction from the public. They're already a little bit wary, given what they've seen about his ability to lead on the world stage and to be a strong commander-in-chief. The second thing, as Mark pointed out, is the inflation piece and the impact that sanctions have on an already fragile economy. And then the third is, there used to be this theory of a rally around the flag, right? So the theory being, in a major crisis with a world power who, no, it's not 1980. Russia doesn't play the same boogeyman role that it did when it was the Soviet Empire, but Big bad Putin invading a sovereign nation still should energize the public to support the president, support the United States. But, you know, I look back during the Obama era, after the killing of bin Laden, Obama's numbers went up a little bit, and then they went right back down. Like there's even something that unified the country so incredibly, within 2 or 3 weeks, it had dissipated, and everybody went back to their camps.
Yeah. Yeah, you know, we as we chatted before, there is, you know, after Iraq, there is a very much inward-looking feeling in the country, and certainly the pandemic and all the frustrations associated with that have people focused closer to home, and I think that is part of it. But I told you, I heard the president's remarks today, and I kind of think that he needs, and maybe he will, we'll talk about the State of the Union in a minute, but I think Americans need to be told, persuaded why it is worth the sacrifices they're about to have to make in order to rein in Putin. Because I bet you, if you ask people about 50-cent increases in gas prices, they're not going to be that receptive to that. And there is a very, you know, look, I mean, it is a more dangerous world for us if if dictators can go and gobble up their neighbors at the point of a gun. It seems to me the president needs to make that case more strongly than he did today.
That's a very good point.
I want to stick with him. I do want to get to Trump and the Republicans. This notion of things being out of control. How much? I mean, the argument that has persistently been made against him by his opponents is by not that he's not a good person, but that he's sort of out of it. That he's not strong enough, that he's not with it enough.
Yep.
And so you have this mismatch of people feeling like things are out of control and concerns about whether he's in command. Does this situation, is it an opportunity to change that? Or does this just add to it because Putin, after all, did go in and...
Right, so it almost feels like a no-win situation, right? Which is, he went in, we said don't do it. He still did it. So as you're hearing from many Republicans who are coming out and saying, we need to stand up to Putin, but the whole reason this happened is because Joe Biden's weak and because of the disaster in Afghanistan. So that's already being set as the
or you have the Trump interpretation.
Or the Trump, which
we shouldn't stand up to Putin, but Biden's weak because he didn't.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Up and down. And
yeah.
so, and then you say, okay, well, now that he's there, we need to punish him for this. So we're going to put these sanctions, which you're going to see the impact in everything from not just gas prices, but our already stressed semiconductor supply chain and those sorts of things. Okay, but what is that going to do? Because he'll still be there. And so we're punishing him, but it's really punishing us. And then he took advantage of you in the first, right? Right. So it feels like very much of a no-win situation, that the only win would have been Putin not going in the first place. Now it's a situation where what he can do is try to look stronger in resolve. He's going to spend a lot of time, I think you'll hear this, I'll be curious what you think, during the State of the Union, talking about the relationship with our European allies, that was frayed under the Trump era. He has, helped to put those ties.
Do people care about that?
No.
Hope he doesn't spend too much time on it
Yeah.
then. So, Mark, all this does tie into the election, because the most reliable indicator of how a party is going to do in the midterm elections is how a president's ratings stand, with the 2 times in which the governing party since World War II has eluded losses in the midterms were in 1998 when Bill Clinton was the economy was very strong. He was popular, and the Congress was very unpopular for an impeachment a lot of people thought shouldn't have happened. And then in 2002, after 9/11, George W. Bush, generally incumbent parties do badly, and particularly so when the president is unpopular. Right now, Biden stands at about 41%. What does he have to do? What would have to happen to change that trajectory?
Yeah, and so that is shellacking territory. And you mentioned 1998 and 2002, and what both George W. Bush had in 2002 and Bill Clinton had in 1998 were approval ratings that were above 60%, which in today's
unattainable.
Politics, right, unattainable by Moses, Jesus Christ. No one could actually get those. In fact, when I was kind of laying out that scenario on, hey, it's the roaring 20s, good times are here, that'd be a Joe Biden with approval rating, you know, those old 60% approval ratings. If you're at 53, 54, that is a great thing for your party. The first thing that Joe Biden has to do is actually get his own party back on track. And a lot of, even in our own poll, shows that you have approval of Democrats or just at the 70 to 80% rating. Well, to be able to get reelected, you need to be at 92, 94%. And so first thing he has to do is bring his party back. And what I've also noticed is not only just the party, but the entire anti-Trump coalition. And it wasn't just Democrats, it was never Trumpers, it was independents. And what I've actually noticed from our own polling and else is that all of those groups have actually atrophied for Joe Biden. And it's just not progressives, it's just not moderates, it's independents, it's the Republicans who supported Joe Biden, African Americans, Latinos, it's across the board. And so, you know, I think it is very possible for a incumbent president who's met some really tough times to get your party back. What we saw in 2018 with Donald Trump, the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court fight really started to rallying Republicans to his side, helped them actually stave off would have been worse losses. And we did see Donald Trump's approval rating go from the high 30s and low 40s to the mid 40s. And that does matter. And, you know, midterm environments are really difficult for incumbent presidents if you're not feeling those great rolling, roaring times. But it's so important to do as best you can, to have a moment like a State of the Union address, to have a Supreme Court nomination, to seize on a kind of international crisis going on, because the more that Joe Biden can get up to 45, 46, 47%, all of a sudden maybe you are saving the Pennsylvania Senate race. Yeah. Maybe you are allowing a Gretchen Whitmer to win re-election in Michigan. But the worse you go and you spiral out of control, then all of a sudden it's like, is Colorado in play? Right. And so the Joe Biden at 46, 47% is much more manageable for a lot of Democratic strategists. When you're in the low 40s, it's hard for almost anyone to win re-election.
Yeah.
So then that comes up to the question of, well, what could motivate Democrats to this coalition? And so there's a lot of talk about what happens with Roe v. Wade.
Right.
That will be the spark, much like Kavanaugh was. It's the Supreme Court ruling in June. It sets off a domino effect, and not just at the federal level, but I think all these governors now are going to have to weigh in on what their states are going to do. Many already are, but it would certainly
makes those state races much more consequential.
Much more consequential. At the same time, you know, it's the Haley Barbour about making the main thing the main thing, and the main thing is still that people are feeling as if, you know, again, the anxiety, the pessimism, and the real bite that inflation and prices are taking on their livelihood, that is still an incredibly important force underneath all of this. So you can have some of these events that may help to like bump enthusiasm a little bit here or organize a dispirited coalition there, but I just don't know that it is not enough to change the entire mood, right? If we were on a level playing field, which is kind of where we were in 2018, we were in peace and prosperity. We just had a president who 50% of the public didn't just dislike, but deeply, deeply, like 1,000 burning suns level of hatred for him. his style was much more of the problem than anything else. And so in that environment, getting your team energized, as Kavanaugh did, was enough to mitigate some of the challenges of a midterm election. But this president seems to have, there's just so many, the challenge is more than just one thing. It's this overarching, I don't know, umbrella of doom.
Yeah, well, I mean...
That's really uplifting. Umbrella of doom.
Yeah.
It's going to be my...
we need to talk after
I
this.
know, I'm having some real...
This has made, of course, a lot of Democrats in some ways nostalgic for Trump because he was such a galvanic force in terms of drawing Democratic voters out. And one of the discussions you both know among Democrats is, well, how do we bring him back into the equation? And can you actually run against Trump and motivate Democrats? This was tried in Virginia. Actually did raise Democratic turnout, but Republican turnout was even greater. And it was greater not because of Trump, but because of local issues like how, school administration, and not so much about critical race theory, which got a lot of attention, but about just general frustration on the part of parents about the opening of schools and the closing of schools and the requirements of their students. And we saw that played out again in San Francisco in an election recently. How much are those kinds of issues motivating voters? And, well, I've got a follow-up question, but I didn't invite you guys to hear me speak.
To me, and particularly in a midterm environment, the most galvanizing force is being of the opposition. Being out of power makes you angry. And so we ended up seeing that when Republicans ended up losing the White House in 2008, and David, when you were in the White House, the Tea Party came into existence, and they were fired up, and we saw the intensity on the Republican side. And then when Trump took over, and Amy was talking about the fire of a burning thousand suns from Democratic voters, we saw the Women's March. We saw pro-immigrant marches across the country. And the energy was on the Democratic side. And now Democrats in the White House, and Republicans have it on their side. The side that also controls the White House becomes complacent. I heard from so many Democrats in the Virginia governor's race. It's like, oh, this is a state Joe Biden won by 10 points.
They kept saying that right up until the end. It was like, it's going to be close. We're going to eke it.
Yeah, no way we're going to end up losing this. And so there is a complacency that sets in by the side that wins. Now, the one other thing that ends up happening, and maybe there's very little that Democrats can do this midterm environment to get their forces as energetic as the opposition, but you have to do enough to be able to save, because every Senate race matters, every governorship, particularly as we start looking ahead to 2024, particularly in those battleground states of Michigan, Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, are going to be for all the marbles on how elections are administered in our next presidential election. So you have to do everything possible. But what one cycle that ends up happening, I think you know this very well, is that so the opposition that is so having their Tea Party marches or the women's marches, and then all of a sudden you end up winning either one branch of one chamber of Congress or both, and then you overreach. And then you become fodder for the incumbent White House to say, look, they went way too far. And that kind of dance has been like the normal.
Well, that actually is, that's my theory of how Democrats could bring Trump back in, because not so much him, but when you hear Kevin McCarthy and some of the House Republicans speak about what they plan, it's generally vengeance and retribution, and you throw our people off committees, we'll throw your people off committees, and so on and so forth. And it doesn't really portend a season of governing. Mm-hmm. And if people are concerned about chaos, if they are concerned about, the sort of things being out of control, is that a vote really for harmony, for progress, for things coming under control? It may not work, but that is how I would certainly look at that as an argument. But Amy, just getting back for a second to this, why you're a parent of a school-age child?
Yes.
Why is there so much anxiety? Why has this become such a crystallizing issue for people? Because this is the issue that caused suburban, particularly women in the suburbs, who might have been from McAuliffe, to move.
Yeah, because I think as Mark said, it's not necessarily about are they teaching critical race theory or what kind of books are in the library, right? There are folks who have latched onto that. But fundamentally, you know, when things are going well, you can overlook some mishaps within the system or things not being as designed exactly how you would like them to be designed. But when the basics aren't getting done, right? When my kid is out of school week after week after week and you are not providing instruction that is at all applicable. You know, there were so many folks on my block would talk about how their kids just shut down completely during that time. And it's not just, and I think this is what parents are the most upset about, it's not just the academic piece of it, it's the social and emotional piece. And there is nothing, as a parent, that is harder to watch than your child suffering, right? You would much rather say, I'll take all of that for you. I just want you to be in a better place. You see these stories of suicide and drug addiction and abuse among a younger set, and it is clear that it has taken a toll on this generation. And so you have parents saying, you know what, your only job is to keep these kids, right, in a safe, nurturing environment, and you didn't follow through on that. And so when you have that anger boiling up, and you had in the case of McAuliffe, someone who never really answered for that. He didn't talk about that.
Well,
and then he made the gaffe about parents shouldn't be, right? And then it took a long time to respond to that, right? He said the parents don't need to be involved. They shouldn't be involved in decisions in the school. And it fed into a narrative that had already been built up, right? I think that gaffe alone wouldn't have cost him the race if we weren't already in this moment. And the fact that Joe Biden's approval rating in Virginia, a state he won with 54%, was 46% on election day. That's that is the bigger weight. So I understood why so many Democrats thought they were going to win, because when they did look at the data, it said he's going to get more votes than Northam. We're hitting all of our targets, which is true.
Meaning McAuliffe.
Meaning McAuliffe was going to hit the turnout numbers he needed to turn out, but it was the Republican base that was even more energized, and they couldn't.
One way to look at the turnout in that Virginia race was that Democrats exceeded Ralph Northam's of 2017, in which he won by 8-9 percentage points. But Glenn Youngkin ended up getting Trump 2020 turnout.
Yeah.
I mean, Republicans, particularly in rural Virginia, where there aren't a whole lot, but they ended up winning all of those rural counties almost 90-10, and they got presidential level turnout for a governor's race. And that turnout, to me, even with critical race theory and the debate and all of that, that was the ball game.
Yeah, and we'll see, because if that is replicated in the fall, that's going to be terribly difficult news for Democrats. So, Mark, you talked about Biden needing to get his own party together, but in some ways, keeping his party together has been the source of a lot of problems for him. And one of the critiques, and it's true on this issue of the schools, that the teachers' unions are powerful within the Democratic Party. They didn't want the schools to open. He was more sensitive to their concerns than the concerns of parents. I mean, that's the critique that's run against him. We know that crime, and certainly we feel it here, but all over the country, this is a huge issue. Homicide rates went up by 30% in 2020. They went up again significantly in 2021. I think there's a pretty good argument that it is a manifestation of pandemic issues, or partly pandemic issues, but the narrative is defund police, and all of that. How much of that is a real problem for Biden? How much is that related to the big drop in independent support? And how does he keep his party together while still being the sort of center-left Democrat that he ran as, frankly.
I think when you remove Donald Trump from being president, I think it's really hard on how you reconfigure that coalition that Joe Biden was able to get with 52% of the popular vote. You know, when you were in the White House, David, the Democratic Party, I almost looked at the tent of the Democratic Party was a perfectly constructed tent. That you ended up having the Ben Nelsons from Nebraska on one side, and then the Tim Kaines and the Mark Warners in the middle, and then you ended up having Bernie Sanders, and you could see how you could end up.
Didn't feel that comfortable to me.
And that's
you remember it differently.
Right. But you could have at least seen it with hindsight, looking where you could center the pole, the main pole, to create your tent. And today, I look at the composition of the Democratic Party, and the tent is moved over considerably. And I think that's made it much harder to govern, and how you're able to make compromises with, you know, Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, with a much more progressive party, and also a party that's actually become a lot more coastal. And you mentioned the problems in urban cities. It wasn't just 10 years ago, but there was a Republican, independent, Democratic mayor, Michael Bloomberg of New York City. Now, in the way that our politics is done, there's not going to be another Republican mayor of New York City. I don't think in my lifetime, maybe. But we have seen a much more progressive, coastal Democratic Party, but still with parts in which you need to be able to have senators from Arizona, or a senator from West Virginia, or maybe having senators from Georgia part of your coalition. And so, yes, you're right. Like, you got to be able to get all the Democrats on one side and actually say the most important thing in politics is to win, and not always. And there's a whole separate debate on whether policy objectives, which are what you try to do with government, you actually end up getting rewarded for. There is still this thought, I think, a lot of Democrats on, well, if we pass X, Y, and Z, we're going to get all this popularity. And I'm not necessarily sure that exists in today's world, and how you end up doing that. But David, the other part of the equation to me is still the ball game for Joe Biden on, are you looking at the swing voters, the people who end up deciding elections? There was a really interesting paper that Elaine Kamarck and Bill Galston ended up doing. It's like the Democratic Party, the 2024 election, the presidential election, is the democracy game. If Donald Trump ends up regaining power, it is over. And so Democrats, at least their argument is, we have to win over the 50-year-old white, voter in Nebraska who doesn't have a college degree, because that person is a swing voter. And yes, maybe there are only 5 or 7% of swing voters left, but they're the ones who still decide elections. And so you got to get your party together, and then you have to win over that sliver of swing voters that still matter.
Yeah, it's like a game of Twister. But and I want to talk about the State of the Union speech, and I do want to reserve some time for the Republican Party as well, because they've got one big orange-haired problem that we should talk about. That's the one potential barrier to what could be a very big November for them. We touched on it before. The State of the Union speech, you talk about this notion that Democrats think that if you pass lots of stuff, that people will reward you for them. And Biden did a press conference on the anniversary of his inauguration, in which he recited all the things that he had passed, that they had done, but not a whole lot about the mood of the country or what we've been through together. What do you think he needs to do in this State of the Union, and how much rewriting do you think they're doing as a result of Ukraine?
You know this better than we do, because you've sat in through it. So I'm sure they're doing a lot of rewrite about that, and trying to, maybe they'll listen to your point about making the case for why this is important for us as a country, not just in the theoretical, the state of the world, global balance, but you as a citizen. What I hear over and over again from voters, we see it in qualitative and quantitative data, is the sense that the administration is not focused on the things that matter to them. Say over and over again, what's the most important issue for you? Inflation. What do you think the most important issue is for Biden and Democrats? COVID maybe, or voting rights? Okay, what's another important issue for you? The economy. Do you think the administration's focused on that? I mean, kind of. Right? So you have to meet people where they are, and I think the challenge, and part of it is this tent issue. I really love this image, by the way. I'm going to steal that. But think about it this way: the White House comes in February, March, April. Vaccines are going out. People are getting vaccinated. Economic confidence is going up. People are spending money. All this money was dumped into the economy, $1.9 trillion getting pumped into the economy. We're not going to have the problem that you saddled them with,
right.
Axelrod in 2009, without putting enough money into the economy. So we had a long, dragged out recovery. This is going to be, we're going to just pop. As soon as these vaccines go in, economy's going to pop. And as Mark pointed out, everyone's going to be happy. But then, to quote Mike Tyson, well, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the mouth. Right? And they got punched in the mouth in August with inflation and Afghanistan and crime and the border. And the response wasn't to say, oh, I guess we got to rejigger what our plan is. It was like, we're going to go full steam ahead. We got to get Manchin on. We got to get cinema. We got to get voting rights. We got to get all these things done. Build back better, which was not where voters were anymore. And again, it goes to that same thing with schools. If you're doing the basics right, if you are blocking and tackling, I say this to people that intern for us, like, you don't need, if you are starting with me and you're going to be doing some things that are really boring, I'm sure for you too, right, that are sort of menial tasks, but when you do the little stuff well, and I see that you're consistent with that, then of course I'm going to let you do the other cool things and I'm going to give you big projects because you've proven you can do the spell checking and the proofing. I think the public would have been much more open to this idea of Build Back Better if things were better.
Yes.
But they're not. And so this looks ancillary. So the Democrats keep coming back at me with, well, but everything in Build Back Better is popular. Look at the polling. Look at the data. GDP is better. Unemployment is low. The economy is booming. You are correct. These things can be true at the same time, that those things are happening and voters don't feel it.
Right. Well, that's the point.
Yeah.
I mean, if you recite that litany to the average person in this country, you are begging for the middle finger.
Yeah.
I mean, David, you put it so well in your op-ed that, the state of this union is stressed. And this White House does have a lot of achievements to be able to tout. Yep. And some of them are historic pieces of legislation. There is, when you look at some of the normal metrics of the U.S. economy, Donald Trump would be crowing with these kind of numbers. But as Amy was saying, like, they're not meeting people where they are. And when you talk about the State of the Union, I'm going to give up. We have an idea for our morning newsletter tomorrow, and it's a little bit provocative off your State of the Union. But should Biden even be giving a State of the Union on Tuesday, given the situation, and given the fact that you have to rewrite everything? And if this situation in Ukraine is as dire as we think it is, should you be having an Oval Office address and saying, I'm going to give this State of the Union address later in the year, and maybe at a time in which the country isn't as stressed and you don't have to have such a bad story to tell on meeting people? And again, I'm probably sure, and this is all speculation, I'm sure the White House will go through with it, but it is kind of provocative on, if so much of the speech is going to have to be about Ukraine, why not have a president from his first Oval Office address, he hasn't had one yet, as president, and telling the American people why Ukraine does matter and what we're actually trying to do, and have that moment, David, where I think people see that there is a commander-in-chief who has his eye on the ball.
Yeah. It is true that they already delayed the State of the Union from January to March 1st, and I think they did that because they were hoping that the virus will have sufficiently receded. And I expect that you're going to hear the CDC probably tomorrow say we're changing the mask regulations and so on. I mean, I think this, they have a plan, and I doubt that they're going to change it. But interesting. You talked about Donald Trump crowing, so let's talk about the crow.
Not the old crow.
Not the old crow.
That's
the
crow.
Crowing crow. But, I think most of the Republican strategists would prefer that he play golf next year. and that he stay out of these races, that seems congenitally impossible for him. And, you know, we just saw this in the last couple of days, him praising Putin and so on, which creates enormous problems for Republicans. How does the Republican Party navigate this? Because I think they all feel they need his imprimatur to win primaries, or at least not have his active opposition.
Correct.
But there's this concern about what his effect will be in general election campaigns that are competitive.
So I don't know that he is going to have as big of an influence on the 2022 races as Democrats would like him to have. Part of it is, even when he was in office, Republicans figured out how to play that game and do that dance of, he does the tweet, you distance yourself from it, you find a way to say it that doesn't anger him, but also doesn't, piss off your base that loves him. So we saw in race after race in 2020, especially at the House level, that the candidates who won in these swing districts actually outperformed Donald Trump. So voters were very able to detach individual Republicans from a Trump Republican. And in fact, because he is so out there, right, this isn't simply that you agree with Donald Trump's ideology. That's not the issue. It's that you are you are personally like him, right? You act like him. You have a personality type similar to his. That's what they're opposed to. And I think your point is a good one, which is for Democrats to focus less on, this is a disciple of Trump. This is somebody who wants to be just like Donald Trump. He hugged him here. He agreed with him there. As much as to say, we don't need more of this tumult and this chaos and the negotiating about what happened in 2020. Again, it would have been an easier argument to make if we had turned the page to a more stable time, and if Biden were able to say, I got us to this place, we don't ever want to go back there. It's harder to do that today. I think what's going to trip up candidates is the same stuff that trips up candidates every time, which is there's something about them personally, right? Things that they've said or done or not done that become problematic enough for voters that they're willing to overlook their overall frustration with Biden.
Just a final point on this. I generally agree with you. The question is, will some of these candidates have to do and say things that do get them in trouble in order to pass Trumpian muster in the primary?
I would disagree, and I 99% always agree with Amy Walter.
It's pretty damn boring, by the way.
It's boring.
But I think so much of Trump's already baked in, and I think the anti-Trump playbook is more potent than a lot of the conventional wisdom suggests. Glenn Youngkin in that Virginia race was never going to be pinned as the Trump guy and was able to extricate himself.
Didn't have to run in a primary, really.
But when we look at a Herschel Walker in Georgia, he is Trump's chosen person and an absolute Trump acolyte with an opposition researcher's dream of information. I look at someone like Carrie Lake in Arizona, and you might not know her name all that well. I'm convinced that come September, October, every American covering the midterms is going to know about Carrie Lake. She is a Trump disciple, a former TV person, really magnetic TV personality, but doing all of Trump's lies in Arizona. And so I do think there were people who can be successfully targeted and tied to Trump that could matter in some races. It's just not going to be all of it.
It's not going to be an easy... Right.
We're going to take questions in 1 second. I don't know where the microphone is going to be placed. Okay, there's a microphone over in that aisle, so queue up behind that mic. As people are doing that, as people are doing that, I want to ask you, we touched on this earlier. I think everyone in this room probably would, or many people in this room would talk about democracy as a big issue, and how our democracy functions, how our elections function, and so on. How much of that is actually an issue for voters?
So it,
Not that these aren't voters, but
no, that you're all important, every one of you.
except you.
If you ask Democrats and Republicans how worried are you about democracy, they're equally worried, but for different reasons.
Right.
Right? So you ask, are you worried about democracy? You'll get a Democrat saying, yeah, because Donald Trump tried to overturn the election, January 6th, blah, blah, blah. Republicans say, yeah, I'm very much worried about democracy. There's fraud everywhere. Did you see what they did with these drop boxes? Did they have ballot harvesting? You don't need voter ID? We absolutely have to worry about that. And so I think it's actually equally energizing. Now, where do independent voters fall on this? I think a lot of them, they see January 6th, they're horrified about it, but they also want to move on. They don't want to, I don't know that they're going to punish Republicans who, voted against certifying the election, or didn't vote to impeach Trump, or didn't say something about January 6th. So I don't think they'll get punished for that. I don't think they want to Mark's point about Carrie Lake, elect people who want more of that, right? Like, let's do more cowbell on January 6th.
No, but
like, we need more of that.
So
There is that fine line. And I think the good politicians are going to figure out, the good candidates, you can already see how they're doing it now. Pennsylvania, I think, is a good example of this. There's some smart Republican candidates who are figuring out, you say some of the Trump stuff. One candidate running in Pennsylvania has an entire ad that's just the "Let's Go Brandon" chant, okay? That tells everybody, don't worry, I'm a Trump guy, but he doesn't have to say the Trump stuff, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of talk about election integrity. You're not going to hear about let's make sure to pardon the January 6th rioters.
Mm-hmm. Do we have people lined up?
We do. We can't see them, but
Yeah.
we're happy that you're there.
Hi, my name's Umar. I'm a first-year MPP, and my question is, I was wondering, what do you think the effect of not following through on the student loan forgiveness promise that he had made? I mean, obviously, we're at a university, and one thing that I haven't been able to, justify to myself is, his lack of follow-through on that. And I guess the standard was kind of set by, Warren, by Sanders. Oh, it's going to be total forgiveness. And then he kind of made the compromise of, oh, I'll guarantee 10,000. So what do you think the effect of that is going to be, and also why hasn't he done it?
It's a great point. I don't know about you, but I hear it come up in focus groups all the time, unprompted.
And when I talked earlier about like the unraveling of the anti-Trump coalition of the 2020 race, I mistakenly forgot to include younger voters. And it's absolutely clear in our polling where Joe Biden's approval rating at the beginning of his presidency was in the high 50s with younger voters, and now it's in the low 40s. And that is absolutely unsustainable. But also it shows you, when I was talking about that tent of the Democratic Party, where I think so many younger voters didn't vote for Joe Biden probably in the primaries. I mean, if you are under the age of 40, you probably voted for Bernie Sanders or at least for Elizabeth Warren. And so how Joe Biden appeals to your generation, to me, it's really hard, and so and maybe doing something like that. But I also know, like Joe Biden, I mean, the answer he keeps on always giving is, I feel like if we do that, we might lose independent voters on why are we spending money on people who, why don't I get a big check? Why don't I get my credit card forgiveness done? And so I think it's a tricky situation, but Joe Biden has to do something to win over younger voters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tara Farwana. I am also a first-year MPP student at the Harris School of Public Policy. So we talked a little bit about splintering in the Democratic Party and different ideologies there. I think you could argue similar sentiments on the Republican side, at least in saying there are pro-Trump Republicans, anti-Trump Republicans, maybe ideologically different. How does this all culminate? Do we continue to splinter further and further? Do we start to see the possibility of, like, maybe the two-party system isn't going to work for us? I know that sounds really far-fetched. What do you think? I'm just curious on your thoughts.
It's not far-fetched. I mean, the idea of, could this be the moment, right, for a real third-party candidate in 24, especially seeing a public that right now doesn't want a Biden-Trump matchup, right? That's a great opportunity. I don't particularly think we're going to see a Biden-Trump matchup, but let's pretend that we don't know. Not let's pretend we don't know. We don't know, so let's pretend for a minute it works that way.
This from Miss Crystal Ball.
There's a crystal ball. It's right here. The one thing that, though, to me that's been fascinating about these last, I guess, 15, 20 years is that third parties have emerged only to be encompassed by the major parties, right? It's a little bit like watching, Facebook or, any of those big tech companies see an emerging cool product and then they come in and buy them out. And so the Tea Party movement and the sort of populist movement that we saw starting actually during even
Occupy Wall Street. Yeah.
Occupy Wall Street, we saw it in the 2008 elections with Mike Huckabee, right? He was that candidate. It just didn't get enough steam until we hit 2010 and 2012. And even Romney was able barely to beat back that populist surge. So Trump brought them in, kept them in, but they're really their own, many of them are their own party. And Bernie brought in a group of voters that really aren't Democrats either. I mean, the fact of the matter that we almost had in 2016 a non-Republican, Donald Trump, going up against a non-Democrat, Bernie Sanders, but what outsiders have been able to do is infiltrate the parties, right? And they use them basically as a vehicle. And so we essentially have third parties already. Right? So it's weird to say this, like, well, we don't have third parties. We have a Democrat, right? But Trump wasn't a Republican, Bernie wasn't a Democrat, and I think you can see in so many cases where these candidates come in, they know that structurally they need to have a party. So they pick a party, Michael Bloomberg, another example of this, but I'm not about that two-party system.
Yeah, Amy, another way of looking at it, in 2016, we saw two hostile takeovers of the major political parties. One was successful in Donald Trump's, one was unsuccessful in Bernie Sanders, but the Democratic Party saying, we want to incorporate your ideas in our platform, we want your voters. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders have a really good working relationship, but I do think kind of going, I don't know if we have a third party, but I think both parties are still ripe for a hostile takeover, just depending on who wins that presidential nomination.
One question I have of you guys is about Bernie Sanders' appeal. What's striking to me about him is he doesn't wade into cultural issues very often. He really is very much about economics and class, and he's been pretty successful with it. Is there something to be learned? It seems to me Democrats always do better when they're focused on economic issues and less well when they're focused on sort of cultural issues.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, to me, when you look back at that San Francisco school board issue, and what really tripped up the members of the San Francisco school board weren't economics based. Like, they weren't saying, let's tax the rich to actually, it was like, no, it was like, let's get Abraham Lincoln's name removed. And there's no doubt.
It's about time someone took that.
Yeah.
My look at the Obama and Trump presidencies is, when I was in college and I loved studying Marxist-based critiques of our politics and history, but I learned like race and geography and culture do matter so much. But Democrats, like, if you had Democrats just saying, all I want to do is tax the rich every single day, instead of like, well, let's be able to, when you start touching culture, it's tougher than on the...
It is, although some of the culture works for Democrats in places like suburban America, with I call them the Peloton moms, like the certain women of high income. We know where they are around this.
Is Peloton still okay? I don't know.
I know. They're doing
Peloton dad.
Yeah, they're okay. Yeah, you don't count. So on guns, remember that used to be a third rail. I think guns works for Democrats as a cultural issue in suburban America. It works against Republicans there.
Yeah, but it does cut.
It works in individual races. It does not work as
this goes to the fundamental
strategy.
issue, which is the Democratic Party is aggregated now very much in cities and suburban areas, and as you cater to those voters, you alienate yourself from
100%.
others. Yes.
I'm not a student, so thank you very much for letting me ask a question. My name is Wolfgang Mössinger. I'm the German Consul General here in Chicago for the Midwest.
Yeah.
And I would like to come back to an issue that is also very dear to my heart. It's Ukraine, because before I came to Chicago in 2019, I was German Consul General in Eastern Ukraine for 4 years.
Wow.
So I know all these places where the CNN reporters are now reporting from very well. I want to come back to this issue. How could Joe Biden convince the general public that Ukraine is an issue that matters to the Americans? And my question is simply, what could we Europeans do to help him to persuade the public that it is a matter that important to them? How could we help to create this sense of urgency to really have to do something about stopping Putin? Because otherwise, if we don't do that, nobody will be safe in the future.
Thank you. First of all, let me say our thoughts are with Ukraine, with Europe right now, and the issue is how do we make the case to the American people? And I think the answer to your question is how you can help, or how the world can help. Is there needs to there is a large thing at stake here, which is if there are no rules, if countries can be overrun at the whim of dictators, then we've run this experiment in the last century. We know how it turns out, and we may think that we're avoiding a conflict, but we may be setting ourselves up for a larger conflict. And anything that is done to underscore that this isn't a one-off, this isn't merely a dispute between two countries. This is the forerunner of really a turning of the clock back. Can there be a forerunner of a turning the clock back? But
Sure.
But this really does portend turning the clock back to a very dangerous time in the world that we thought we had passed 70 years ago or 80 years ago. But I should ask you guys to...
No,
My only take is that I know it's been easy to criticize Joe Biden, at least in the last 24 hours, on, should there be more sanctions? Why aren't you going after the SWIFT banking funds? Or, why didn't you do this earlier?
It's that.
But what I will say, and it's still incredibly early, but to me, I think a sign of a success for the West is over the next several months, if not the next several years, that the United States and Europe remain absolutely united. And that, to me, at least, I'm not a foreign policy expert, but a lot of the moves that Joe Biden has decided to make has been to keep that unity and not getting further out of the skis from where Germany wants to be, or where France or the UK are. And so it has the potential to be a success for the entire West if we remain unified. And I know that in our current politics and with all the strains of nationalism that are in all the countries that I just named, that's going to be a really tough task. And I think maybe introspection for our countries and ourselves on kind of keeping that unity.
Yeah. In that sense, Putin may have done a service.
Well, aren't we going to get the first test in France, right? So Macron is up. It's June elections in France. So there's your first sense of whether this nationalist inward focus on us fervor maybe gets tamped down a little bit, and we do need to stick together in the ways that we have seen thus far work. And again, after we heard for 4 years, it wasn't just America first, it was NATO's taking advantage of us. NATO needs to pay up. This is a scam. It's a sham, right? Why do we still need these things? I don't know that this is going to solve that. I don't know that voters, 2 weeks from now are going to say, well, I'm really glad we have NATO. That was great. But Putin just overthrew an entire country, and we kind of had to stay on the sidelines. Now I get the reasons for this, but now what, right? So it leaves still a very uncertain taste for many folks.
Yes.
My name is Daniel. I'm an MBA student. I really enjoyed a lot of what you said about the mood, as pessimistic as it was.
Sorry.
I think I feel it too.
You enjoyed that, huh?
The umbrella of gloominess or something.
Yeah.
But it's interesting for me. I think one of you mentioned this is kind of perhaps a Churchill moment for Biden. Yet I think one of the biggest criticisms he's had publicly from Republicans and privately from Democrats is that he struggles perhaps more than Obama did at motivating and inspiring the nation. And so really my question is, how confident are you that he can really rise to that occasion over the next 6 months and change that perspective?
I liked David's point in your op-ed about the empathy piece. Lean into what you're good at. I mean, I keep hearing from folks on the Democratic side, why doesn't Biden get out there and sell, sell, sell? You know, Trump would be pounding, let's say pre-Ukraine, pounding on the economy. Even though there's the umbrella of gloom, don't be gloomy. Look how great things are. The economy's great. I'm going to bring it back. Things are great. Things are great. With Ukraine, it would be, I'm so tough, right? He would be constantly selling himself mostly. But that's not Biden's thing. His thing is the empathic, what did you call it? He has like just an innate empathy.
Yes, and preternatural empathy,
Yeah.
but he also, two things, it's that and middle-class Joe, the guy from Scranton who knows what's going on in people's lives, who doesn't think like Washington, he thinks like middle America. Those are his strengths. And that hasn't been as evident as he's talked through
Right.
these issues. He sounds too much more like Washington.
And in fairness to Joe Biden, one thing that they've struggled before this Ukraine crisis really has been COVID. It's really hard to go to Scranton multiple times or hit the road.
Yeah.
And the White House has really been very cautious because it would be a destabilizing moment, even with the Omicron variant, for the President of the United States to be able to come down with the coronavirus, although we saw that.
But it's not even that, it's not that his being isn't there, although I think that it'd be great to be out there, but it's just that he's not speaking to what's going on out there. But I think the question's a little different, which is, does he have the ability to hit those high notes? And, I think he's been uneven in that regard. But if ever there is something that he feels passionately about, it certainly is this. Mm-hmm. And he does have this opportunity on Tuesday in the chambers of the Congress to, if he doesn't take your advice, to speak to it, and we'll see if he can hit those notes. Part of it is on the speechwriters themselves. This actually, Biden talks about wanting, there's all this talk about he could be another Roosevelt, he'll pass all this. But really, one of Roosevelt's great legacies was how he talked to the country in times of crisis and boiling these things down to very digestible principles. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that's what's needed here. Kind of a fireside chat type tone about what's at stake and why sacrifice is important. Yeah, I think we have...
Hi, my name is Annie Henderson. I'm a first-year MPP student at the Public Policy School. My question is quite nitty-gritty, which is, thank you for smiling at that.
I love nitty-gritty.
So, quite nitty-gritty, which is, I think what's really interesting is right now demographics determine a lot about who you vote for. And to your point, that the kind of universe of swing voters is ever shrinking. What demographics or geographies are you particularly focused on to get a sense of, the tenor of the midterms races as you're looking through it?
Well, Mark, you have your counties.
Yeah, we have a county-to-county project at NBC News where we're actually going in to look at different county types, and one of which is like a swing voters has been Duval County, which is Jacksonville, Florida, which has been very swingy even going back to the Obama era. Other counties that, that more so than, I'm still focused on the suburbs. I think that when we look at any kind of geographical, that suburban voters are probably the most up for grabs people. And maybe because it's where they are in their lives. You might be, your political views when you are 20 years old might be much different when you're in your mid-40s. And conversely, once you end up becoming a senior citizen as well, too. And it does feel that when you have children and they're struggling in school and dealing with remote learning, and to be able to have candidates who can address the people and look through your focus groups and pollsters who you identify as a swing voter. But I also think, to me, like part of politics, and I feel like that we ended up slicing and dicing the electorate so much, where we talked about Barack Obama's coalition or Donald Trump's coalition. Like, talk to Americans. Like, I feel like as a country still we have more things in common than not, and to be able to have rhetoric that speaks to everybody, that where you're just like, well, I just want to turn out my base and I'm going to win elections. Whereas if you have the most unifying message, and I know like it's really hard after the last several years to actually how you speak to, I want to be able to speak to somebody who voted for Donald Trump and who voted for Barack Obama and Joe Biden. But I do think they're out there, and to have like a message where all of a sudden you end up hearing from people say, that person maybe could have been a Republican, maybe they could have been a Democrat, but they're speaking to me. And I know finding that candidate, like that's the next goal in our politics, but I think it still can be done.
I think there are people in a laboratory working on that right now. Amy, you want to take a crack at that
take
question?
a swing.
At who are you looking at that will tell the tale of 2022?
I agree with Mark's, and also we're going to spend a lot of time looking at Latino voters. Unfortunately, there aren't enough organizations doing polling there because it is much more expensive. You have to get a much bigger sample. To do a national sample, it's much harder than if you were just going to do a national sample of all voters. So the amount of work that it takes to do it is more complicated. However, we'll have results, right? We're going to have results in Texas, especially in and around the Rio Grande Valley. We're going to have results in Arizona. We're going to see, though, and this is the challenge about a midterm electorate, just what we talked about earlier of the differential turnout. Who's more likely to turn out in a midterm? Usually they're older, usually they're better educated, usually it's a much whiter group of voters. So it's not going to potentially give us, right, the insight that a presidential turnout will provide. But I think what we're continuing to see cycle after cycle is incredible turnout. 2018, 2020, this governor's race in Virginia, really high turnout there. So we could be looking at, the level of turnout that can give us some insights where normally you would say, it's a midterm year, don't take it too seriously. But watch where those voters that, when you assume here's who Latino voters are, here's what they are worried about, when you've been assuming that for the last 10, 20, 30 years, and then those assumptions turn out to not come to fruition, you have to take a deeper, longer look.
Yes.
One reason Putin did invade was to prove that economic sanctions could not deter him. So one very powerful American response that could be made is to greatly increase energy exports. And Republicans, of course, will be calling for that.
Yeah.
But of course, this involves pipelines and fracking and whatnot. So how should Biden handle that? One move he could make is to say that stopping Putin, punishing Putin, and even getting Putin so unpopular he's removed in Russia takes priority. Or will this cause like fractioning in the Democratic Party? So what impact would that have on the midterms if Biden said the top priority now is punishing Putin?
I was listening to Michael McFaul, who was your ambassador to Russia during the Obama era, and he made the point that nothing can convince Vladimir Putin, that there's someone, elections are shams in Russia, that maybe Vladimir Putin is off the deep end and no level of sanction, no matter of energy will convince him otherwise. But one of the focus on sanctions, and maybe even your question on energy independence and making a lot of the oligarchs suffer, is a long-term play. That the only way to break off people would be months and years. And that's going to be really, really difficult on being able to pull that off. And I just, to me, I think there's an open question on whether we're dealing with someone who is rational. We're trying to have all these rational policies and thinking that would actually stop him. I'm not necessarily sure anything would.
Well, this was the challenge for President Biden when gas prices started to go up, right? And you have the climate president saying to OPEC, can you guys just pump a little bit more, help me out? So that balancing act, now, again, this is where the frustration comes in. We should be able to have a conversation in this country that says, I can be both pro-climate and also pro-energy, and this is how we do it, as opposed to the conversation that it comes down to, you're fracking, bad, or you're anti-fracking, you're destroying jobs and the economy. So there is that balance there, but I don't know that he can do that today. But when you talk to folks in the energy industry, they're like, we have the possibility to ship, right? What do we have? We have a lot of natural gas that can be shipped to Europe, but it's going to take incredible infrastructure and investment. And to your point, saying, yay, keep on doing it, guys. We love more fracking.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah, this is why those presidents get the big bucks.
It is.
Yeah, it's a hard job.
It's a hard job, man.
Yeah.
I mean, it looks easy.
I'll tell you what's not a hard job is moderating a discussion with you guys. And I so appreciate you, Amy and Mark, for being here tonight, but also for your splendid turns as fellows here, and Amy, your continued service as a member of our advisory board. So thank you for all of that, and thank all of you for your questions.